Some truths are not buried in earth, but in lineage, silence, and the flicker of oil on canvas. It begins with a dried rose in a chapel window and a name so carefully protected, someone was willing to kill for it. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. The hour grows late, and Holmes is already steps ahead. It was one of those grey London mornings in late October, when the smoke from the city's countless chimneys merged indistinctly with the mist outside, casting Baker Street in a subdued gloom. I sat by the window, a neglected newspaper upon my knee, and observed my friend Sherlock Holmes, who, for once, had condescended to a posture of perfect idleness. Reclined in the armchair opposite mine, he stared fixedly at the ceiling, his long fingers steepled under his chin, the pipe between his lips emitting occasional thin spirals of smoke that hung in the stale autumn air like whispered thoughts. There are times, I have observed, when Holmes withdraws from even the most trivial discourse, becoming not merely silent, but inaccessible, as though his mind were a library shut for inventory. I had grown accustomed to these moods, and I had learned not to interrupt them. The fire crackled gently in the grate, and the street sounds below rose and fell with a muffled rhythm. It was the sound of the letter slot snapping shut that broke the stillness. I turned toward the door, but Holmes was already on his feet, his hand snatching the morning's post from the floor with uncharacteristic alacrity. "Nothing, nothing, nothing," he muttered as he flicked through the envelopes. "Ah, but what have we here?" He held up one envelope between two fingers, and in that moment, I recognized the first flicker of energy that so often preluded some curious and unlooked-for adventure. The envelope was heavier than ordinary, and bore a seal, wax of deep crimson, pressed with a crest, unfamiliar to me. A thistle wrapped in ivy. Holmes examined it with care, his pale fingers turning it over as one might a beetle of rare variety. He raised it to his nose and sniffed. "Lavender," he murmured, almost to himself. "And not the modern perfume, Watson, but the oil once used by housemaids to line old trunks and linen cupboards. Intriguing." The parchment itself was fine, but aged, and the hand that had addressed it to Sherlock Holmes, Scroll 221B Baker Street, was elegant, firm, yet slightly uneven. An educated lady's hand, I should have said, betrayed by subtle tremor or haste. Holmes did not open it immediately, but instead tapped it against his palm and smiled in that faint, sardonic manner which indicated that his mind was already some paces ahead of mine. "I believe, Watson," he said, "that we may soon be exchanging the smoke of London for the mists of the countryside. Come, let us see whether the letter bears out the promise of its perfume." With that, he broke the seal and unfolded the thick page within, drawing his chair once more toward the fire, as though this was a ritual long practiced and savoured. I leaned slightly forward in my chair as Holmes's voice filled the sitting room, low and clear, as he read the letter aloud. "Mr. Holmes, I write to you from Dunsworth Hall in Shropshire, a place where honour was once held in the highest esteem, though it may now lie buried beneath years of silence. You do not know me, and yet I know of you, as does any who still trust the mind over whispers and family prayer. I ask for discretion, and I ask for haste. There has been an opening, a cupboard once sealed, now disturbed. I cannot say more by post, except that something lies behind it that ought never to have been hidden, and perhaps something else that should have remained so. If you come quietly. Lady Eleanor Trevelyan." Holmes folded the page and stared into the fire for a moment before turning his eyes upon me. "Well, Watson, there is very little to go on," I said, my mind still piecing together the unusual phrasing. "A cupboard, a secrecy of long standing, and an anxious noblewoman who knows your name. It is vague in the extreme." "Vague, yes," said Holmes, "but not void. Note the tone. Something lies behind it that ought never to have been hidden. A moral statement, not merely factual. And then, something else that should have remained so, the implication of dread. One speaks of conscience, the other of fear. You draw all that from a handful of sentences. I draw only what is there to be seen, my dear Watson. He rose and paced the hearthrug, the letter still in his hand, now crumpled slightly from the pressure of his grip. I watched him fall into one of his familiar states of abstraction, the signs of which I had come to recognize as reliably as a sailor watches the changing clouds. "It is the cupboard," he said at last, halting abruptly. "That is the hinge upon which the matter turns." "The cupboard? Yes. Why mention it at all if it is merely a piece of furniture? She says it was once sealed, now disturbed. It is not the object, but the disturbance that has forced her hand. Someone has opened that which was meant to remain closed. What might lie in such a place? A document, a family relic, a letter from a dead hand. Or bones," he said simply. I said nothing. "She fears scandal, possibly disgrace. Dunsworth Hall, Shropshire, old name, old money. If the Trevelyan name has been compromised in the past, it is likely to have been buried under stone and silence. Now something has shifted, and she fears it will rise." He returned to his chair and began sketching idle shapes in the air with the ash from his pipe. "Do you note, too, the peculiar cadence in her plea? Not hidden, should have remained so. She knows more than she dares write, Watson, and yet the appeal is honest. It is a letter of a woman at war, with her sense of duty. I confess I hesitated. It had been only a month since our return from the affair of the Martingale Club, and the wounds sustained in that endeavour, though minor, had left me with a sense of physical weariness I had not yet quite shed. The thought of damp country roads and the weight of old family secrets did not immediately stir my enthusiasm. "But what if it is a ghost story, Holmes?" I ventured, half in jest. "Some echo of childhood fancies, a draught in the hallway mistaken for spectres and guilt." Holmes gave a short laugh. "Ghosts do not write letters sealed in wax, Watson." He rose once more and reached for the railway timetable, which he kept meticulously updated on a shelf near the window. "There is a train to Shrewsbury at 9:30 tomorrow morning. I believe we shall take it." "You are quite decided, then?" "My dear fellow," he said, turning back to me with that glint in his eye which I had come to know as the herald of imminent adventure. "When a woman writes of dust and dignity in the same breath, there is always a mystery worth our attention." And so it was settled, though neither of us could have known it then. The mists that awaited us at Dunsworth Hall would not easily lift, nor would the truth they concealed yield to daylight without resistance. The train bore us westward through the shrouded lanes of Shropshire, the fields outside appearing and vanishing in intervals, as banks of fog rose and dispersed like indifferent stagehands drawing a curtain upon the landscape. Holmes was uncharacteristically silent during the journey, his gaze fixed beyond the window, though I knew well his attention was not on hedgerows or farmland. His long fingers drummed a slow pattern against the silver tip of his walking stick, and only once did he speak, to murmur, "Closed rooms tend to accumulate more than dust, Watson. They keep time differently." We alighted at a modest station some miles from the estate, where a hired carriage awaited, its driver a silent man with a soft cap and eyes as unrevealing as damp stone. The ride from there took us along a winding, tree-lined road, the woods on either side too quiet for comfort. There was a brooding quality to the countryside, as though nature herself had drawn inward in hesitation. When the gates of Dunsworth Hall finally appeared before us, Hall ironworks set into crumbling stone, they gave the unmistakable impression that they opened more often to memory than to visitors. The house itself was of that noble but neglected kind one often finds in the border counties, Elizabethan in structure, Georgian in taste, and overgrown in all the corners where sentiment had overtaken stewardship. Ivy draped its outer walls like mourning lace, and a single bell peal from the gate summoned a butler whose eyes did not conceal his curiosity at our presence. Lady Eleanor Trevelyan met us in the great hall, a high-ceilinged chamber adorned with ancestral portraits whose expressions had long since faded into aristocratic detachment. She was a tall woman, past 60 but composed, with silver hair arranged in a coronet and a black lace shawl drawn tight over her shoulders. Her bearing retained traces of former elegance, but it was undermined by a nervous energy that betrayed itself in small ways, fingers that worried the edge of her sleeve, a voice that paused at the wrong syllables, eyes that glanced too quickly toward the staircase and back again. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said with a tremulous smile. "You have no idea how long I hesitated before writing, but something has changed. You see, it has been opened." Holmes bowed slightly. "We are at your service, Lady Trevelyan. May we take it that you refer to the cupboard mentioned in your letter?" Her lips compressed. "The cupboard, yes, but it is not merely the object itself. It is what it has disturbed in the household, in the air of the place." She led us through the corridor, her movements careful but strained, as though afraid that one misstep might provoke some long-sleeping thing. As she gestured toward the parlour, I noted her hand trembled faintly, like a leaf not yet fallen, but already loosened. "It was my sister's room," she said in a low voice. "Beatrice's. No one has spoken her name aloud here in many years." We were soon shown into the drawing room, where a young woman sat by the tall window, her profile half lost in the play of autumnal light. Clara Trevelyan, Lady Eleanor's niece, was a figure of such quiet fragility that one hesitated to address her without first announcing the thought. She turned as we entered, and though her eyes met ours, there was in them a strange opacity, as though her gaze reached only as far as it must, and no further. She rose and greeted us with mechanical civility, her voice scarcely above a whisper. Her dress, though finely made, hung on her as if she had forgotten to care for its fit, and her hands, pale and slender, twisted unconsciously in her lap. When Lady Eleanor introduced us, Clara responded with a shallow nod, but seemed immediately to withdraw into herself again, her eyes returning to the garden beyond the window. "Clara has been unwell," Lady Eleanor offered delicately. "These past weeks have troubled her more than she will say." Holmes regarded the girl for a moment, not unkindly. "The mind," he said, "is often afflicted not by what has occurred, but by what refuses to occur, what remains unsaid." Clara flinched, almost imperceptibly, and then rose, murmuring that she would take the air. She passed from the room with the ghost-like silence of a memory leaving a dream, and Holmes's eyes followed her until the door had fully closed. "She fears something," he said quietly to Lady Eleanor. "Something that has not yet named itself." It was shortly thereafter that Julian Trevelyan made his appearance. There was in him that particular variety of English charm that resides more in the execution than the intention, a cultivated ease, a hand extended just so, a voice pitched for laughter even before a jest is spoken. He was fair-haired with features pleasing in symmetry, and eyes that had mastered the art of mirth without warmth. I have known men who smile as if to conceal their teeth. "My dear aunt," he said with affectionate irony, "you have at last allowed yourself the drama of outsiders. Mr. Holmes, I presume." "You presume correctly," Holmes replied, neither curt nor cordial. "And Dr. Watson, the ever-loyal chronicler." He gave a slight bow. "A pleasure." Holmes offered a faint smile. "Your presence, Mr. Trevelyan, suggests the house has retained at least one voice untroubled by ghosts." "Ah," said Julian, pouring himself a glass of Madeira from a decanter on the sideboard. "But ghosts, Mr. Holmes, are often of our own manufacture. As I have told my dear cousin Clara, melancholy is a habit, not a verdict." Holmes accepted the remark with a silence more loaded than speech. He had already taken measure of the man, and I could see in his glance the inward sharpening of thought. Julian was practiced, polished in manner, fluent in surface sympathies. But Holmes's gaze went deeper, and I suspected already that he had found something amiss beneath the polish. Later that afternoon, Holmes requested a word in private with Lady Eleanor. She led him to a small study overlooking the rear grounds. I followed at his side, but did not intrude upon the conversation, instead taking up a quiet seat by the bookshelf and feigning interest in the family volumes. The talk between them was hushed but earnest. "I did not intend to open it," she said, her voice low and strained. "I had it locked the year Beatrice disappeared, and I have not entered since. But last week, one of the servants dislodged the key. I found the door open." "You found it open?" Holmes repeated. "Yes, and there was a scent in the air, lavender, and something else, older. I felt as though I had stepped into a dream left unfinished, and there was something moved, an embroidery left unfinished. The needles still in the cloth." Holmes inclined his head. "And what has become of the room now?" "I had it shut again, but it is too late. Clara found her way in before I could stop her. Since then, she has not been herself." Holmes studied her in silence for a long moment. "There are rooms that hold dust," he said, "and there are rooms that hold breath. I believe yours is of the latter kind." Lady Eleanor met his gaze with a look of quiet desperation. "Mr. Holmes, if there is something behind this, if what I feared all these years is not merely guilt but fact, I must know, even now." "You shall," he said simply, "but be prepared. Truth does not knock like a guest." The parlour into which we were again shown bore the weight of silence in a manner I have seldom encountered. It was not the quiet of politeness nor of mere absence, but a stillness of another order. A hush laid carefully across the room like an heirloom shawl no one dared disturb. The fireplace was unlit, though a single candle flickered near the mantel as though placed there in defiance of the encroaching twilight. Lady Eleanor sat near the hearth, her posture stiff, hands folded with such precision that it seemed less an act of comfort than of self-command. Holmes stood beside her with his usual composure, though I detected a softer set to his mouth, as if even he recognized that the room called not for cleverness, but for patience. "You must forgive me," she said at last, her voice barely more than a murmur. "There are things which, even after 20 years, do not come easily to the lips." Holmes inclined his head without pressing her. She looked down for a moment at her hands, then up at the window as if seeking some point in the past that still lingered in the fog beyond the glass. "My sister Beatrice was to have been married," she said. "The dress had been chosen, the papers sent to the papers, and the invitations posted, but she never reached the altar. She vanished 5 days before the ceremony. Vanished, utterly. Her room was locked," Lady Eleanor continued, her voice steadier now, as if recounting the details allowed her to rise above them. "There was no sign of violence. Her gloves were still upon the dressing table, and the fire had burned low but steady, as though she had only just left. But she did not return." Holmes had taken a chair and was observing her with that quiet attention which has always struck me as his most formidable instrument. "She had spoken to no one of any intention to leave?" he asked. "To no one," Lady Eleanor replied. "And indeed there was no reason. She had no quarrel with the family, and her fiancé, Arthur Vale, was deeply devoted. They were to be married in the chapel here at the Hall. Everything was prepared." "What of her effects?" Holmes inquired. "Letters, journals, keepsakes?" Lady Eleanor paused. "There was a letter," she said, her voice low again, "or part of one, a sheet torn from her stationery, found by her lady's maid and brought to me. It was addressed to no one and ended mid-sentence. I still have it." She rose and fetched from a small drawer a folded page, yellowed at the edges, which she passed to Holmes. He opened it and read aloud. "I know now what he is. He is not who he says. And if I vanish, It will be because... He stopped. The final line bore no punctuation, only a dash. The ink trailed faintly at the end, as though the hand that wrote it had been interrupted. Did she speak to you of any suspicions? Holmes asked, carefully folding the paper. No, said Lady Eleanor, but she had grown withdrawn, not fearful exactly, but alert, as if she were always listening for something that had yet to be said. Holmes leaned back, his long fingers steepled before him. And Arthur Vale, how did he respond? Lady Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, and I thought I saw the years upon her all at once. He was distraught beyond what I had thought possible in a man of his temperament. When the days passed with no word, and it became clear that she had not run off by design, the scandal began to gather. And then came the whispers. Whispers? That Beatrice had lost her nerve, that there had been impropriety, that Arthur had been in debt or disfavoured. Ridiculous things. But poison seeps through even the finest stone if given enough time. Holmes gave a slight nod. And what became of him? He was told, kindly but firmly, that the engagement could not be honoured. His presence became too great a reminder, both of loss and of rumour. He left for the continent. I heard, years later, that he had taken ill in Marseille. He died without ever marrying. She turned her gaze to the fire now, which crackled softly as the candle on the mantel sank low into its pool of wax. Beatrice was the last light of the younger generation, she said, and when she vanished, it was as though the future of the family vanished with her. For a time, none of us spoke. Outside, a raven croaked distantly in the dusk, and a draught stirred the drapes like a breath remembered from another room. Holmes rose at last. "Thank you, Lady Eleanor," he said gently. "You have given us not the conclusion, but the beginning of the matter. And beginnings, I assure you, are always the more vital thing. There are families in England whose tragedies become part of the soil that surrounds them, unspoken, but sensed, like the faint iron tang of blood long since washed from stone. In the days that followed Lady Eleanor's account, I came to understand that Beatrice Trevelyan's disappearance had not so much ended a chapter in Dunsworth Hall's history, as it had created a page that no one dared turn. Her name, though once spoken with such fondness, as I gleaned from old photographs and a lone music book inscribed in her hand, was now employed only in euphemism or avoided altogether. The household had learned to speak around her absence, as one skirts a missing stair or a burnt patch on the parlour rug. And yet, everywhere I looked, she lingered, in the dustless corner of a hallway table, kept inexplicably clean, in the rosebush that Clara watered daily, though it had not flowered in years, in the fact that no one had ever reassigned her bedroom, nor removed the velvet sash that still hung from its door handle like an abandoned promise. There were, too, the faint remnants of town gossip, vague, inconsistent and disfigured by time. Some had claimed she fled with another man, others insisted she had gone mad. One housemaid, long dismissed, was rumoured to have said she'd seen Beatrice the morning after her disappearance, though no date was ever agreed upon and no detail survived scrutiny. It was as though the village itself had conspired in an act of forgetting, not for want of truth, but in the name of something more durable, the maintenance of appearances. And in that silence, I could not help but feel a sorrow that was less about what had happened than what had not been mourned. Holmes, however, had no use for sentiment where structure might be examined. It was late one evening, as the house fell into that peculiar hush, peculiar to large country homes, where even footsteps seem aware of old secrets, that Holmes requested a second audience with Lady Eleanor. I accompanied him, though said little. He opened the conversation not with apology or preamble, but with a simple question. Did Beatrice ever voice reservations regarding her impending marriage? Lady Eleanor blinked. She was quiet in the days preceding it, but no, she did not protest the match. nor did she express a desire to travel, to delay, to alter the ceremony. No. Then I must ask, Holmes said, folding his hands, why the announcement in the Shropshire Herald stated that the ceremony was to be held at St. Cuthbert's in the village, when your own chapel here had already been prepared and adorned. Lady Eleanor looked sharply at him, then away. That was a printer's error, she murmured. A rather specific one, Holmes replied gently. It suggests to me a last-minute change, perhaps one not yet communicated beyond your household. She said nothing. Her silence was eloquent. Holmes continued, his tone steady. And the torn letter, was it discovered on her writing desk or in the waste bin? In the fire grate, she answered, half burned. I see, he said, and paused a moment longer before adding, you said earlier that Beatrice vanished 5 days before her wedding, but the housekeeper told me the family began inquiries only 3 days before the date. Why the delay? Lady Eleanor did not respond immediately. When she spoke, her voice was lower than before. Because I believed, I hoped, that she would return of her own will. Holmes inclined his head respectfully and did not press her further. But as we left the room, he leaned toward me and whispered, It is not what she said, Watson. It is what she omitted. And so I followed him back through the quiet hallways of Dunsworth, the sound of our boots soft against the aged wood, and felt for the first time that we were no longer walking through a house, but through a story not yet ready to be told aloud. The key was produced with a solemnity I can liken only to the presentation of a relic. Lady Eleanor withdrew it from a velvet-lined box concealed within a drawer of her escritoire, her fingers hesitating a moment before clasping the tarnished brass. I had nearly thrown it into the lake, she confessed in a voice not quite steady, but I feared that doing so would only summon more ghosts than it silenced. Holmes took it without comment, though I observed the care with which he turned it over in his hand. The ridges were worn smooth with age, and the bit still bore faint traces of a reddish oxidation, no doubt the result of years spent untouched. It has not been used, he remarked. Since the autumn of '78, Lady Eleanor gave a small nod. Not by me, nor by anyone, with my leave. We followed her through a westward corridor lined with faded portraits and the occasional ancestral bust, until we reached a narrow door set slightly apart from the others. It bore no nameplate, but Holmes touched the frame with his fingers and said, This was Beatrice's. She said nothing, only placed the key into the lock with a hesitant twist. There was a click, not loud, but with a resonance that felt strangely final, and she stepped back. I shall not go in, she said. But you may. Her eyes lingered on the door for one last moment before she turned and walked away down the corridor, the hush of her steps quickly swallowed by the carpet. The room exhaled as we entered, not with sound, but with presence. A chill, dry air greeted us, unmoving, as though it had waited for this precise moment to be acknowledged again. Dust lay thin but undisturbed across the furniture, save for a delicate trail of footprints belonging, no doubt, to Clara, whose visit Lady Eleanor had so guardedly confessed. Holmes did not speak at first, but his gaze moved slowly from object to object, the half-drawn curtain, the faded watercolour still hanging above the dressing table, the books arranged with such fastidious neatness that their present disuse only heightened their former care. There was a faint scent in the air which I recognised as lavender, though time and the wooden panels had rendered it thin as memory. On the bed, a coverlet of pale blue had yellowed slightly at its edges. No personal effects cluttered the space, no jewellery, no gloves, no perfumes, and yet the room seemed crowded with a presence just beyond reach. It is not how she left it, Holmes said at last. It is how they froze it. You mean Lady Eleanor? Not she alone. The house, the family. Grief does not preserve. Denial does. He moved to the writing desk, opened it gently, and studied the contents. A silver pen with oxidized nib, a dry inkwell, a press blotter marked faintly with lines of reverse script. But see, he said, indicating a patch of dust along the edge of the desk. A volume once lay here, removed recently. It left a clean outline, likely a book Clara carried away in her visit. Do you believe she meant to find something? I asked. Holmes's brow furrowed. Or she already knew what was missing. It was while inspecting a side table stacked with small keepsake volumes that Holmes paused, his hand resting lightly on the spine of a book that had been tucked askew behind the others. He pulled it forth and opened it. Between the pages, brittle with age, lay a single dried rose. He held it up between finger and thumb, its petals long since desaturated to a paper-like pink, the stem snapped but still bearing its tiny thorns. On the margin of the page, it had been pressed against, there was a handwritten date, September the 12th, 1878, 3 days before Beatrice vanished. Holmes handed it to me without comment. I turned it gently in my palm, struck by its fragility, and perhaps too by the care it must have taken to preserve something destined to wither. A gift, most likely, I said. Perhaps, he replied. Or a signal. Dried flowers are not merely mementos, they are conclusions. It was placed here deliberately, and with a date marked. The question is whether it was meant to be remembered or to be hidden. He replaced it with the reverence one accords a page of scripture, and we moved on. Behind the dressing table stood a wooden panel, slightly misaligned with the others. Holmes noted the seam at once, and with careful leverage from his penknife, pried it gently away. Within was a hollowed space, scarcely large enough for a hand to pass through. Nestled inside lay a diary bound in green Morocco leather, its corners softened by time, but its clasp still intact. Holmes opened it and turned to the final entries. The handwriting was elegant, though progressively more erratic across the final pages. The ink blurred in places, not from water or damage, but from what appeared to be a trembling hand, or the haste of fear. I cannot look him in the eye today. He smiles too readily. He always has. But now it seems to me a mask rather than a gesture. He does not speak of the past, though I think he remembers more than he allows. I feel watched even when alone, even in this room. Another entry. The rose was meant for me, and I received it. But I no longer believe it to be a token of affection. It has the air of a warning. And then, dated one day before her disappearance, I know now what he is. Not who, but what. A name is only a costume, and I have seen through the seam. Holmes closed the diary slowly. She was frightened, I said. More than frightened, Holmes replied. She had begun to understand that her fiancé, or someone close, was not who they claimed to be. Holmes's gaze fell next upon the embroidery frame that stood near the window, its wood now slightly warped with age. A linen cloth was stretched taut across it, bearing the unfinished image of what appeared to be a lily, outlined in pale thread, but incomplete. The needle remained embedded in the fabric, its eye threaded, though frayed. Holmes stooped to study the last few stitches, his brow drawing tight. See here, Watson. The pattern was being filled methodically, but notice how the thread ends abruptly, without a knot or break. I bent closer. She was interrupted. Indeed, and not merely called away. There is no bookmark, no fold to indicate she intended to return to it shortly. Whatever caused her to leave the chair did not allow time to secure her place. He examined the chair's cushion, gently lifting its edge. A faint indentation remained in the velvet, suggesting it had not been sat in since. Someone came to her here, Holmes said quietly. And she did not resume what she was doing. That is the shape of it. I looked again at the half-formed lily, now resembling more a question than a flower. What was said to her, Holmes? He rose and looked once more around the room. Enough, he said, to change the course of her life, or to end it. The gardens at Dunsworth Hall, though once a point of familial pride, as evidenced by the faded engravings that adorned the drawing-room albums, had long since surrendered themselves to nature. The gravelled paths had crumbled into a soft tapestry of moss and root, and the laurel hedges bowed from age. their branches heavy with both overgrowth and neglect. Here and there, a rosebush bore a single late bloom, defiant amidst decay. As if reluctant to concede the season's turn, Holmes walked ahead of me in silence, his cane striking the occasional stone with a muted click. He paused now and then to examine a discarded branch or trace the weathered outline of a broken trellis. There was a peculiar stillness in the air, as though the very soil resisted disclosure. "There is something to be said," Holmes remarked quietly, "for the geography of memory. That which is suppressed in the parlour often thrives among the shrubs." I made no reply, but drew my coat closer. It was an unseasonably cold morning, and the mist had not entirely lifted from the lower reaches of the grounds. We approached the edge of the chapel path, where ivy spilled across a cracked sundial, and a tangle of nettle fought with the remnants of lavender. Near the potting shed, we found the man we sought, Mr. Pewter, the estate's gardener of over 3 decades, whose back was bent with labour, but whose gaze remained sharp beneath thick grey brows. He tipped his cap as we approached, not from deference, I suspect, but from habit deeply etched. Mr. Pewter regarded us with a mixture of curiosity and patience, wiping his hands on an old cloth before leaning his spade against the bench beside him. "You'd be Mr. Holmes, then," he said, not as a question, but as a declaration. Holmes inclined his head. "And you would be Mr. Pewter, the one man at Dunsworth whose roots run deeper than the rosewood." The old man gave a soft grunt. "I've outlived the dogs and most of the masters. Never thought I'd outlive Miss Beatrice, though." "She made an impression on you?" "She was kind," he said simply. "Knew the Latin names of everything, even the ones I didn't bother with. Used to say the garden had a better memory than the house." He paused. Maybe she was right. Holmes nodded toward a shaded stone bench under the pergola. "And you were here the evening she vanished?" Pewter gave a slow nod. "I was pruning the lilac just beyond the yews, not 100 yards from the west wing. It was just after tea, dusk setting in." "What did you see?" "I didn't see," he corrected, "but I heard. Voices, close. I knew them both well enough. Miss Beatrice and Mr. Julian. They were arguing, or rather, she was upset, and he was trying to keep his tone down. Do you recall what was said?" The old man's face creased further. "Bits of it. She said, 'It's a lie, and you know it.' And then something like, 'You'll never be him, no matter what you sign.'" Holmes stilled. "What you sign?" "That's how I recall it. She was angry, but not frightened, until the end. Her voice changed just before she left. Softer, but, well, like someone who sees something too late." Holmes bent slightly, his hands resting on the head of his cane, and studied Pewter with renewed focus. "Mr. Pewter, you said Miss Beatrice accused Julian of not being him. Did she call him by name?" The gardener hesitated. "Now that you mention it, yes. She didn't call him Julian. She called him, wait now, Henry. Plain as you like." "Henry?" Pewter nodded. "It caught me because I'd never heard her call anyone that before. I thought maybe it were an old beau, or something else." Holmes straightened and glanced briefly toward me, though his expression betrayed nothing. "And how did Mr. Julian respond?" The gardener frowned, sifting the memory like soil between gloved fingers. "He went very quiet, said, 'That name doesn't belong here any longer.' Then she laughed, just once, a sharp sort of laugh, and then I heard her walking off fast. Toward the house?" "No," Pewter said, "toward the chapel path." Holmes fell silent, eyes drifting to the horizon where the chapel spire pierced the mist like a forgotten exclamation. His fingers tapped the handle of his cane in measured rhythm. "You've been very helpful, Mr. Pewter," he said at last. "If memory is a garden, then yours is still well tended." The gardener gave a shrug, then stooped to his tools once more. As we walked back toward the house, Holmes's voice broke the quiet. "Watson, there is no Henry on the family register. No cousin, no servant, no suitor by that name." "And yet she used it," I said. "And he did not ask who she meant." "Precisely," Holmes replied, "which tells us that whoever Henry was, Julian knew exactly what he represented. And why the name had to be buried." The morning air hung heavy and damp as Holmes and I followed Mr. Pewter's measured steps toward the chapel path, where ancient stones bore the weight of centuries and whispered of solemn rites long past. The gardener paused, his gaze fixed upon a worn patch of earth near the edge of the walkway, where the roots of an aged yew twisted like gnarled fingers beneath a thin veil of moss. Holmes knelt with deliberate care, his fingers parting the earth with an artisan's precision. The soil was loose here, disturbed, as if the ground itself bore a secret burden. After a few moments, his hand brushed against something hard and metallic, a faint glint barely catching the meagre light. "Here," Holmes said quietly, extracting a small object encrusted with dirt and roots. The gardener stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "It looks like an old piece of jewellery," I observed, brushing away the earth to reveal a delicate locket, tarnished but unmistakably crafted of ivory and silver. Holmes examined the find with his customary scrutiny. "A shallow grave," he mused, "most likely hidden in haste and hope that time would conceal it." His gaze drifted to the weathered stone cross that marked the edge of the chapel grounds. Beneath the path of procession and prayer, yet secreted in darkness, we exchanged a glance, the gravity of the discovery settling upon us like the shadows lengthening around the spire. The locket lay open upon Holmes's palm, revealing within its delicate frame a faded miniature of Beatrice, her countenance wistful, the brushstrokes soft but resolute. A small curl of hair, pale and silken, rested beside the portrait, held fast by the clasp's delicate tension. Holmes traced the contours of the miniature with his finger, his expression unreadable. "A keepsake concealed," he said softly. "A token meant for remembrance, yet abandoned here in the dirt. There is irony enough in that." The gardener shifted uneasily. "It was buried here, Mr. Holmes, but who would want to hide a thing so tender?" Holmes tapped the locket's clasp thoughtfully. "Betrayal, Mr. Pewter, often bears the face of affection. This locket speaks not merely of love, but of loss and concealment." He looked up at the chapel's towering windows, their stained glass catching a stray sunbeam. "Its presence here suggests more than mere accident. Someone wished to bury not only the object, but the sentiment it represents, and in doing so, raised questions that none here have yet dared answer." The afternoon waned, and as we made our way back toward the house, I pondered the delicate balance between love and secrecy, the fragile threads upon which the fate of Dunsworth Hall now seemed to hang. The dining room that evening bore an atmosphere curiously unlike that of previous nights. The fire burned steadily, and the wine flowed with measured civility, yet there lingered in the air an expectancy, a tension woven too finely to be acknowledged aloud. I could not place the source of this alteration until, midway through the soup course, a new voice joined the conversation. "My friend, Mr. Alton, has kindly agreed to break bread with us," Julian announced, as if adding a spoonful of sugar to an already stirred cup. "He and I met by chance in town, and I thought it would be rather diverting to introduce him to Dunsworth's ever enigmatic hospitality." The man to whom he referred inclined his head modestly. He was of middle height, lean, with a complexion weathered by foreign climes. His hair, once black, had turned to iron, and though his bearing was that of one accustomed to silence, there was an intelligence in his eyes that belied his reserve. "An old associate from overseas," Julian added, by way of further explanation. "Mr. Alton has spent a good deal of time in Alexandria, I believe." The man's accent, faint but definite, caused a curious flicker in my memory. I could not place it, but something in the cadence, not quite colonial, not quite metropolitan, stirred a vague sense of recognition. He spoke little during the meal, answering inquiries with the polished brevity of a man who has spent many years measuring each word. And yet, from the corner of my eye, I saw Holmes watching him. Steadily, silently, as one might observe a chessboard just before the endgame. Mr. Alton handled his fork with perfect precision, yet when the conversation turned, almost idly, to the subject of Beatrice Trevelyan, I noticed a subtle stiffening in his shoulders. Julian, perhaps deliberately, had raised her name while recounting a tale of the Hall's former garden fetes, noting how Beatrice once organised a summer masque that left the guests both sunburned and spellbound. A polite ripple of laughter followed, but Mr. Alton did not join in. Instead, his hand faltered momentarily, the knife resting on his plate just before the meat had been fully sliced. Holmes, seated opposite, had not missed the movement, nor had I. "Is this your first visit to Shropshire, Mr. Alton?" Holmes inquired with casual politeness. The man nodded, replacing his knife with composure. "First time, yes, though I confess I have read something of the region's charm." "Indeed," Holmes replied. "One might say it hides more beneath its soil than above it." I saw the faintest twitch at the corner of Mr. Alton's mouth, whether of amusement or unease, I could not determine. What struck me most, however, was a peculiar gesture he made while dabbing the corner of his mouth with his napkin. He touched, unconsciously I believe, the side of his left wrist, just below the cuff, where a pale scar ran the length of the bone. It was a brief contact, yet to Holmes, whose memory stored such details like fossils in strata, it registered as a tremor before a quake. The remainder of the meal passed without incident, but Holmes's silence deepened, and I knew that some coil had been wound within him, awaiting the proper question to spring. It was over the claret, served with customary solemnity in the drawing-room, that Holmes struck the first note. "I wonder," he said with a measured tone, "whether you ever made use of the older French consulate offices in Cairo, near the Bab al-Luk quarter, if I recall correctly." The inquiry was aimed toward no one in particular, but all eyes turned to Mr. Alton, who raised his brows faintly, then replied, "I may have passed through it once or twice." "The walls there," Holmes continued, sipping his glass, "were painted in an unfortunate shade of mustard, if memory serves. Though I understand the offices have since been moved." "Yes," Mr. Alton replied, and for the first time his voice wavered slightly. "They were moved nearer to the railway station. The old building had suffered from flooding during the spring rains." There was a moment's stillness. Julian glanced from Holmes to his guest, then back again, as if struggling to interpret a language he did not speak. Holmes smiled, not unkindly. "I wonder, Mr. Alton, if we have not met before. Or rather, if you have not met others who know me by reputation." Mr. Alton's glass halted mid-air. He set it down slowly and folded his hands in his lap. "Perhaps we should speak plainly," he said. "I believe you have already guessed what I have come to confirm." Holmes nodded once. "Arthur Vale, I presume." It is difficult to convey the precise stillness that descended then, as if the very air in the room had withdrawn in deference to the name. Julian's smile evaporated into a tight, unreadable expression, while Lady Eleanor, seated beside the fire, exhaled as though some long-held breath had finally escaped. "I am not here to disgrace the family," Arthur Vale said at last, his voice low but clear, "nor to stir ghosts. I have lived with mine long enough." "You have lived in the East," Holmes replied, "under the name Alton for, I would guess, nearly 2 decades. 17 years, Vale corrected. A teacher in Tangier, a clerk in Alexandria, an ill-paid interpreter in Algiers. The heat is less cruel when one has no name to burn." Julian's voice cut in, controlled but tense. "Then why return now? What purpose could it serve?" "To know the truth," Vale said, turning to him. and perhaps to offer it. He turned next to Holmes. I heard, not a year ago, from a chance acquaintance, a former member of your city constabulary, that you had solved a matter involving a family not unlike this one. And I thought, if anyone could tell me whether what happened here was grief or something darker, it would be him. Holmes inclined his head. And what is it you believe happened here? Arthur Vale looked not at Holmes then, but at the fire. That she was taken from me, he said. Twice. His voice held neither anger nor appeal, only the weight of an emotion so long worn it had become indistinguishable from habit. The first time, he said, was when she vanished, and no one, not her family, not the parish, not the police, ever gave me more than murmurs, no accusation, no comfort, just silence. And the second? Holmes asked gently. The second, Vale replied, was when I realized that silence was not the absence of knowledge, but its concealment. There was a fear here, of scandal, of inheritance, of names spoken too plainly. I was offered money to leave, not by Lady Eleanor, not directly, but the message was made clear. He looked now at Julian, whose face had settled into an expression of practiced neutrality. I never believed she ran away, not Beatrice. She would not have done so without telling me, without a word. That was not in her nature. And what do you suspect instead? I asked. Vale's eyes returned to the hearth. That someone wished her gone, and made her so, because her presence threatened the story they had chosen to tell. There was no reply, but the silence that followed no longer felt hollow. It felt full of implication, of things unsaid, and now, perhaps, unsilenceable. It was the following morning when Holmes paused beneath a stretch of corridor not far from the east wing staircase, his step arresting so suddenly that I nearly collided with him. The hallway was dim and seldom trafficked, its windows admitting only a sluggish light filtered through ivy-choked panes, and yet there, hung at deliberate height above a side table of mahogany, was an oil portrait unmistakably rendered in the pre-Raphaelite style. She faces the corridor, Holmes murmured as though to himself, a position neither hidden nor hallowed, merely visible and yet unregarded. I followed his gaze and found myself confronted by the likeness of a young woman in white, standing amid a garden I recognized from the south lawn, her hands loosely clasped around a closed fan. Her gaze turned slightly to her left, just off canvas. There was a gentleness to the posture, but also something unfinished. It is Beatrice, I said. Undoubtedly, Holmes replied, and curiously, no one has mentioned her portrait, not Lady Eleanor, nor Clara, nor Julian. It is as though it hangs not for remembrance, but for quiet forgetting. I stepped closer. The frame was modest, but well maintained. No dust clung to the corners, and yet the painting itself bore the faintest impression of having been altered. Holmes raised a hand, not to touch, but to trace the air before the canvas. Faces can be changed, Watson, more easily than names. But paint, paint never quite forgets what lies beneath. The effect was subtle, so subtle, in fact, that I might have overlooked it had Holmes not drawn my attention to it. At first glance, the face in the portrait bore no sign of distortion, and yet, upon careful scrutiny, there emerged a faint irregularity in the brushwork about the left eye and the line of the jaw. Note here, Holmes said, indicating the cheekbone. The pigment is thicker and the gloss uneven, a hasty repair perhaps, or a concealment. I stepped back and studied the canvas again. Do you believe someone altered her image? I do, not to enhance, but to erase. Gently, artfully, but no less deliberately. But why? The rest of the painting appears untouched. The background, her posture, even her hands. None suggest revision. Holmes's brow furrowed, because it was her face alone that posed a danger, either to someone's memory or to their lie. We stood in silence for a moment, the hush of the corridor pressing in around us. It was not the stillness of peace, but of reverence gone stale. I thought again of Beatrice's diary, her final entries, the rose pressed in a book, the interrupted embroidery, and now this, an image preserved, yet falsified. Holmes tilted his head. And yet, he said quietly, they kept it. They could have removed it, burned it, replaced it, but they didn't. That tells us something. What? That someone wanted to forget her, but not entirely. They wanted the story to survive, just not the truth. A thought stirred within me. I could swear, I said slowly, that I glimpsed this portrait on our first evening, only then it looked different. The angle of the eyes, perhaps, or the line of the mouth. I thought little of it at the time. Holmes regarded me with a faint smile. Ah, Watson, your instincts are truer than you credit. There is no trick of the light here. Someone has made quiet alterations, likely within the past day or two. But for what purpose? To preserve a fiction. A portrait is, after all, a kind of testimony, one that cannot be cross-examined, unless, of course, one knows what to look for. He turned and examined the lower right corner of the canvas, where the artist's signature had been discreetly inscribed. I suspect we are not finished here, he said. Not by a stroke. Holmes stooped to inspect the signature more closely. The name was that of a relatively obscure artist, L. Mortimer, not unknown in London circles but hardly celebrated. Yet Holmes's interest lay not in the name itself, but in what lay within it. The M is curious, he remarked. See how it curls at the base? That is not affectation, Watson. It is a cipher. He produced from his pocket a small magnifying lens and studied the mark in question. It is a monogram within a monogram. Someone has embedded a message here. Within the painter's name? Indeed, and likely not by the painter himself. Mortimer's real hand is evident in the rest of the composition, but this flourish has been added, probably after the fact, and beneath the final layer of varnish. He withdrew a handkerchief and gently buffed a section of the corner with the faintest pressure. There, he said. Do you see it now? Just below the signature, faint etching into the varnish. I leaned closer. There, almost invisible, were two Latin words, veritas, obtecta. The truth concealed, Holmes translated. Hardly the usual flourish of a landscape artist. And here, just above, note the numerical scrawl, 12 to 1078, the day Beatrice disappeared. Precisely. He stood and looked again at the painting, but now his gaze seemed to pierce through the surface. This was not merely touched up, it was revised, hidden, and signed again. Not by the artist, but by someone who knew what had been done and sought to leave their confession, or perhaps their defiance. Holmes did not move for some time. His eyes lingered on the final curls of the paint, the varnish like a thin pane of ice holding something darker beneath. Then, very softly, he traced the tip of his finger just beneath the flourish of the M. Look again, Watson. There's a second curl, not decorative, but formed deliberately. I peered closer. It resembles a letter. Two, in fact. J.T. Julian Trevelyan, I whispered. Holmes nodded. It is a cipher within a cipher. He has left his mark not only in initials, but in design. It was he who arranged for the face to be softened, obscured. He could not bring himself to destroy the portrait, nor to allow it to remain unchanged. So he compromised. A face blurred into gentleness, a signature buried in artistry. But why mark it at all? Holmes's eyes did not leave the canvas, because even the guilty crave witness, and because the truth, once tampered with, leaves behind the outline of its absence. This is not merely art, Watson, it is evidence. And the brushstroke was not that of remembrance, but of fear. It was well past midnight when we made our way toward the chapel, our lanterns half muffled and our footsteps carefully placed to avoid the more resonant stones along the gallery. The hallways of Dunsworth Hall were unlit, save for a glimmer of moonlight through stained glass panels. ghostly shapes cast in amber and blue upon the flagstones, as though some half-forgotten saint still wished to mark our passing. Holmes had said little since the discovery of the altered portrait. The conviction in his movements had only grown quieter, more precise, as though every thought were now converging toward a single point. He carried with him a folded scrap of drawing paper and a soft, bristled brush, items whose use I did not yet understand. I carried the lantern. The chapel stood detached from the main house, accessible by a stone cloister arched with ivy and long disused. It was a modest structure, its buttresses bowed by age, the interior lit now only by the flame Holmes kindled and set within a brass holder in the centre aisle. The silence was immense. The marble effigies lining the nave stared upward in their eternal poses of intercession, their clasped hands worn smooth by generations of wind and candle smoke. There was no congregation here, no breath of worship, only the chill of stone, the weight of centuries, and something else, expectation. Holmes knelt at the base of the chancel steps and removed his gloves. "The Trevelyan family vault lies beneath," he murmured, "and I believe we are about to meet its most reluctant guest." Holmes moved along the eastern wall of the crypt with a slow, searching eye. The vault had been sealed for decades, perhaps longer, and yet the dust told a different story. There were faint scuff marks where none should have been, and the telltale residue of disrupted mortar, subtle, but not to him. "Note, Watson," he whispered, kneeling. "The mortar between these two slabs is newer by some years, less pitted. See how it flakes along the edge, while the others remain settled and firm." I brought the lantern closer. Now I saw it clearly, one stone among many, identical in shape but not in age. It bore no inscription, no carved dedication, simply a slab of pale slate, framed by granite, with a fine line of settling earth at its seam. Holmes took the paper and brush from his coat pocket and dusted the surface. The grit came away in slow circles until the bare stone showed beneath. He tapped it once with his knuckle. Solid. Again, slightly to the right. Hollow. "There," he said, "beneath this." With careful leverage, he slid his fingers beneath the loosened edge, and with my help, the slab shifted just enough to reveal a space below, dark, close, and still. A stale breath of air escaped, and with it the unmistakable scent of linen aged beyond recognition. Holmes lowered himself and lit a match. There, beneath the stone, was a narrow cavity scarcely larger than a coffin's breadth, lined in rough stone, and at its centre, something wrapped in the tatters of white. The candlelight danced over the contours of a form I shall not soon forget. There, curled not in peaceful repose but in unnatural stillness, lay the skeletal remains of a woman. Time had reduced her flesh to shadow and dust, but the bridal lace still clung to her bones, like cobwebs spun of memory. Her hands, skeletal but delicate, were folded loosely at the waist, and in one, the right, lay a broken comb of ivory and tortoiseshell. Its teeth snapped unevenly, as if clutched in a final gesture of protest or recognition. A faint shimmer, perhaps once satin, had pulled beneath her like the suggestion of a forgotten veil. Holmes did not speak. He simply knelt beside the recess, his eyes moving from the hands to the collarbone, from the curve of the ribs to the neckline of the tattered lace. "She never left," I murmured. "No," Holmes said quietly. "She was taken here and hidden, not buried with dignity, not mourned in ceremony, but sealed like a shame beneath the very altar that would have witnessed her wedding." He reached for the broken comb and turned it gently in his hand. There were scratches upon its edge. Letters, perhaps, initials, but too worn now to read with certainty. "The comb," Holmes continued. "She used it. She dropped it. Perhaps she gripped it even in fear, or perhaps it was the last thing that still belonged to her, when all else had been denied." I looked again at the delicate remnants of the veil, now reduced to threads and silence, and in that silence I felt, not for the first time in that place, that Beatrice Trevelyan had never left Dunsworth Hall at all. Holmes remained crouched for some time before the sepulchral cavity, the broken comb held delicately between thumb and forefinger. Then, without a word, he rose, brushing his coat sleeve absently, and motioned for me to follow him out of the vault. We emerged once more into the hushed corridor of ancestors, where the air seemed lighter now, though not freer. Back in the drawing room, under the watchful eye of the extinguished hearth, Holmes unfurled a sheaf of notes from his pocket and began to speak, not to me, nor to the empty armchair opposite, but to the air itself, as if reasoning aloud before an unseen jury. "It was not rage, Watson," he said quietly, "nor sudden impulse. It was the cold, curated betrayal of a man who had too much to lose and no imagination for mercy." He laid upon the table 3 objects: a torn diary leaf, the tarnished locket, and the corner sketch of the altered portrait. She was to marry Arthur Vale. They were engaged. Secretly, yes, but earnestly. The locket contained his likeness and a curl of her own hair. The diary, fragmentary though it is, makes reference to the ship delayed from Alexandria and to the promise he still honours. He paused, letting the fireless grate speak in its own silence. She waited. Vale returned at last, though under an assumed name. Perhaps he was a changed man, as war and debt and memory are apt to change one. But she loved him still. She sought to tell her brother, to free herself of the masquerade the family had imposed. The gardener heard them quarrel that night. She called Julian by another name, usurper, I suspect. I nodded slowly. And the portrait, Holmes gestured to the charcoal scrap, altered subtly, her expression dulled, the eyes reshaped. An act of revisionism. One does not edit the dead unless the truth of their gaze condemns the living. "And the slab?" I asked. "Not merely hidden, Watson, erased. She did not run, she did not elope, she was silenced, entombed with neither rite nor record beneath the chapel's sanctified path. But the irony lies in the concealment, for every act to bury her only bound her more firmly to the place. Ghosts, as you know, linger not because they wish to be remembered, but because they were never fully acknowledged. We found Julian Trevelyan alone in the study, seated at the escritoire with a half-drained decanter beside him. The hour was late, but he seemed not the least surprised to see us. Holmes stepped forward and laid the broken comb upon the blotter without preamble. "She is beneath the chapel, Mr. Trevelyan. Her veil still clings to her bones." There was no gasp, no startled denial. Instead, Julian reached for the decanter, poured what remained into his glass, and drank it slowly. "Then the vault has spoken," he said at last, his voice devoid of tremor. I confess I felt something cold stir along my spine. Holmes seated himself opposite with the quiet formality of a magistrate. "You needn't rehearse your denial. I shall not ask you how you did it, only why." Julian set down the glass, folding his hands with measured calm. "She would have ruined us," he said softly, "not out of malice, but from blindness. Beatrice believed the world would accept her choices without question. She was wrong." He turned his gaze to me, not pleading, not ashamed, merely exhausted. "She intended to bring Arthur back into the family, to declare the engagement before supper that very night. But Arthur was no longer a Trevelyan. He had no inheritance, no station, no allegiance to our legacy. Father would have disowned her. His will would have been rewritten before dawn." His voice faltered, but only for a breath. "I asked her to wait, to reconsider. She refused, said love had no patience. She laughed. He closed his eyes, not in remorse, but recollection. "I did not plan it. I swear that. But when she raised her voice, when she said she would write to the solicitor herself, I acted. I placed the laudanum in her wine. I waited for her to fall asleep." Holmes's face was carved in stone. And then you carried her to the vault. Julian nodded once. She had spoken of the chapel often, said she felt closest to our mother there. I thought it would be fitting. He rose and poured himself a second glass, which he did not touch. I killed her to save us all, he said at last. Holmes stood. And in so doing, you damned every corner of this house to silence. The great drawing room of Dunsworth Hall, with its heraldic glass and ancestral portraits, had taken on the solemn hush of a tribunal chamber. All present sat not as hosts and guests, but as witnesses awaiting sentence. Holmes stood near the hearth, hands lightly clasped behind his back, his face pale and grave beneath the flickering gaslight. He began without flourish, outlining the sequence of deductions not for triumph, but for truth's grim unburdening. He spoke of the gardener's memory of muffled footsteps, of the locket unearthed beneath the chapel path, of the portrait whose expression had been tampered with in oil and varnish. He described the faint scent of laudanum that still clung to Beatrice's preserved veil, and of the cipher hidden in the brushstroke, a signature that bore Julian's own encoded hand. But motive, Holmes said, turning toward Julian, who had not raised his eyes once, is not always born in rage. Sometimes it grows from fear, the fear of scandal, of inheritance diluted, of bloodlines questioned by love not sanctioned. He paused, then gestured toward a folded page on the escritoire. This is your father's original draft of the will, unsigned. In it, Beatrice's name appears as sole heir, with a note, upon her marriage to Arthur V. You intercepted it, Julian, and you acted. Julian did not speak, nor did he deny. The burial beneath the path, Holmes concluded quietly, was not a concealment. It was a coronation in reverse, a deliberate exiling of blood from stone. Lady Eleanor had remained composed throughout Holmes's address, though her gaze had grown increasingly hollow, her fan idle in her lap. But now, at the finality of those words, she rose stiffly from her seat. I knew, she whispered, but the voice betrayed her. Not all, but enough. Her hands trembled as she reached for the mantle, and I stepped forward instinctively, though she waved me off. A silence passed, long enough to encompass several lifetimes. Before she spoke again, her voice cracked by something older than grief. We were taught to protect the name, to prune what threatened it. I thought I was doing what was right. Her gaze lifted to the portrait above the hearth. But I see now, we were merely burying what was human. And with that, Lady Eleanor collapsed into the chair behind her, not with drama, but with the weariness of one who had been holding up history with her shoulders and could no longer bear the architecture of pretense. A single sob escaped her lips, then silence again, deeper than before. Clara had not spoken during any of it. She had sat by the long windows with her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap, her posture still as an etching. When at last she rose, it was with a calm that struck me more keenly than Eleanor's collapse. I will leave in the morning, she said to no one in particular. The solicitor may send whatever papers remain. Holmes turned slightly, as if to speak, but held his tongue. Clara looked around the room, her eyes passing over the portraits, the silver-framed miniatures, the clock with its relentless chime. I do not know if I ever loved this place, she said softly, but I loved the version of us I believed in. Then she crossed the length of the room, opened the door with quiet finality, and vanished down the corridor. The echo of her heels seemed to mark the end of some long inherited fiction. Later that evening, Holmes and I walked the eastern garden paths. The wind had risen, playing through the long grass, like the memory of something once whispered. As we passed the chapel's narrow windows, Holmes paused and gestured toward a ledge. There, half lodged in the sill, was a single dried rose, its petals curled, its stem brittle. It had clearly been placed there some time ago, forgotten, or perhaps deliberately left to decay in the open air. Holmes plucked it gently and turned it between his fingers. Curious thing, Watson, he murmured, his voice reflective. The rose is beloved not for its endurance, but for the way it yields to time. And yet men, families, legacies, reputations, they strive always to resist decay, to preserve, to deny change its due. He looked up at the dark chapel. But silence, when used as mortar, will crack, and every stone laid upon a lie must someday bear the weight of its own collapse. We stood there for a long while, saying nothing more. The moon had risen high above Dunsworth Hall, casting a soft gleam upon its stained walls. Somewhere far off, a nightbird cried, and then fell still. As we departed Dunsworth Hall that final morning, the mist clung low to the hedgerows, as though the very earth wished to conceal the truths we had exhumed. Holmes walked in measured silence beside me until, reaching the narrow gate by the lane, he paused. "Ancestry, Watson," he said at last, "is a curious currency. Some spend it proudly, others hoard it to the point of madness. But the moment one kills to preserve a name, one loses all claim to its honour." I glanced back at the manor's solemn facade. And yet, it was not hatred that drove him, Holmes, but a warped notion of love. "Indeed," Holmes murmured, "love turned inward becomes fear, and fear, left unchallenged, makes tyrants of sentimental men." He turned, the gravel crunching beneath his heel. "Come, my dear fellow, there is nothing more to be seen in this place but weathered roses and weary ghosts. But what do you think was Julian Trevelyan's gravest mistake, his crime, his silence, or the belief that some truths must stay buried? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if this mystery moved you, do like, share, and subscribe for more stories from the shadows Holmes once walked.